Hi, this is Patty Hodge and Dr. Nurses Rock. This morning I have a friend who's been in my life for many decades at this point.
About 40 years.
Yes, sir. Um, Roy Grayson-Wallace was married to my best friend, a woman that I knew from childhood, from actually, I think, fifth grade is when we first met. And Diane uh, passed many years ago, and Roy, as a mental health professional and father of their two children, has a story to tell. Roy worked as a behavior specialist for New York State with psychiatrically hospitalized adolescents and chronically mentally ill adults and adults with developmental disabilities. And Diane ran a school-age childcare program for the YMCA. So Roy's story with Diane started in the 1990s, and I'm going to let him tell you. So welcome, Roy.
Thank you, Patty. Um, yeah, if we're talking about uh, grief, I just want to say up front that that's totally connected to coping with life's challenges. And so, this particular story I sort of see is starting with when Diane was first diagnosed with breast cancer, which was when would have been 1994. Um, and our kids at that point were 2 and 4. And the breast cancer diagnosis wasn't, was shocking, but it didn't. I think there was one node involved. And so the doctors, did a mastectomy, removed that node, recommended some chemo, which Diane did. And, they give you we hope it's all good. And good luck. And so we, weren't too thrown by that. And then things got much worse a year later. So about 6 months after the chemo had ended, the some symptoms returned, and we went back to the doctor, and they told us that it had metastasized, I believe, to her liver. And at that point, and at that time, the prognosis was bleak. And Diane's so one of the first challenges for me was that Diane's way of dealing with that diagnosis was very different from mine. So what she told the doctor, and we were very lucky because the doctor did exactly what she asked. Give him a lot of props. Um, she said she didn't want to hear anything about percentages or the likely. All she wanted was his advice on the best chance of her surviving to raise the kids. So she didn't want to hear that this was a 1 in 100 shot. She didn't just, what can I do that would give me the best chance of surviving another 18 years? And that was a challenge for me because I would I like numbers and facts and wanted percentages and coping. And so even eventually the doctors talked to us about stem cell transplants and how this was a sort of developing technology at that point and that they were hopeful about it. Um, and that was following Diane's guidelines. Well, I read some of the research, and at that point, what they were talking about was extending life 6 to 18 months, not cures, not long-term survival in the research. Now, things have progressed since then, but anyhow, so um, that was really the start of the hard part of the journey. And um, the she went through some more chemo. Um, We then had a friend who, Al Query, I don't know if you remember him. He was part of the Peace and Justice group from St. Uh,
Joseph's.
It was St. Joseph's.
Yeah.
Um, and they had this technology where they were, if they could reduce the tumors in the liver to a small enough size, they could blast it with lasers and then do a stem cell treatment. And they thought that might be a possibility of a cure. Um, so we were all on board with that. But we had to shrink the size of her tumor to less than, I believe it was 5 centimeters. Um, and so did the chemo. The tumor was shrinking. It was down to like five and change or something. Um, we drove out to Pittsburgh. Um, because of the trend, we thought they would be able to do this procedure. Um, she got on the table, they measured it again, and it had exploded to 9 centimeters, and she was not a candidate. And because we were in Pittsburgh, we weren't dealing with her oncologist, and a different female oncologist came into the room and was really quite blunt with her that, she needed to make her final plans. And um, so, as you can imagine, that was a pretty dismal ride back home from Pittsburgh. And at that point, it was really just a question of how long she could hang on. And um, in line with her direction to her doctor, we really, as far as I was concerned, were in the dark about how long this process would go on. Um, at that point, up until then, she'd been able to continue working, maybe at a somewhat reduced style. But relatively soon, she started getting weak enough that she couldn't go to work. And the YMCA, her employer, was wonderful. They continued to pay her salary, even though she couldn't come into work for another 4 or 5 months. And as that point, we applied for a disability retirement for her. She was a little reluctant to do that because it was such a final type step. Um, but it made a huge difference for us in the long run. Another worry at that point was that about money. We were a two-income family, and when I initially talked to the local YMCA office, they couldn't tell me what the benefits, what the situation was going to be if she did die. So it turned out that the WISE program was very generous, but they just didn't tell me that. So so finances were one part of the issue. Another part of the issue was her parents, and particularly her mother's complete denial of what was going on.
Yes.
And so the next thing that really I remember so vividly was Brendan, who was at this point had just turned 4, came to me one weekend morning and sat on my lap and said, "Mommy's dying." And nobody had said that out loud. So I don't know how he knew that, but he knew it. And it wasn't a question. He was telling me. And so while I was taken aback, I knew that I couldn't disagree. I had to support him that um, that was what we were dealing with. Um, I have no recollection of what I said, but he didn't seem particularly upset about it. It just was a fact to him. Anyhow, Diane got progressively weaker. Another fortunate thing was that she was able to be completely mentally in charge of her treatment right to the last day, so that I never had to make any decisions, which I was grateful about because I worried that her parents would second guess me if I had to make any decisions. And we her oncologist went on vacation for a week and things were going downhill and she was hospitalized. And we didn't want to talk to the other doctors in the practice. We'd met some of them, didn't particularly like them, didn't have the same rapport we had with Dr. Theo. So we waited for him to get back, and he got back, and he acknowledged that things were really quite close to the end, and that he did not think further chemo was likely to help, but he'd be willing to start another round if that was what we wanted. And at that point, Diane was having a great deal of trouble breathing. It had gone into her lungs. And and she said she was tired and ready for it to end. And so they put her on a morphine trip that she controlled, and she died the next evening, with a lot of friends and family in the hospital room. Um, she was on the phone with Tom and Carolyn, our sort of spiritual director connection in Cleveland, and they said prayers for her. And she let go pretty peacefully. Um, and that was the end of that and start of the next stage for us. Um, I went home and brought the kids into my bed. They were asleep. And in the morning, I told them that mommy had died. Um, and so we were very fortunate. The kids were both in a private Catholic school, and the school and the other parents were just wonderfully supportive at that point, and continued to be because it took several years of ups and downs. Devon's personality changed. She became much quieter and more withdrawn. Uh, Brendan was angry. The school often used Devon to come into Brendan's class if he was too upset as a way to comfort him.
Well,
Um, and they did most of that without telling me about it. They did not report the daily ups and downs. Apparently, there was an incident when Brendan got angry and was banging another child's face into the ground. Again, they dealt with it. They didn't call me up and say, they just dealt with it. And it took several years, but eventually Brendan graduated at the top of his class in eighth grade. So, but it was at least 3 years, and I think more like five before he started to get his act together academically. Um, and but he also made really good friends in that school, and he still has a bunch of them now, and they're quite close as a group, even though one's in Michigan and one's in Colorado, and it's quite great the connections he made. Uh, Devin also made some really good friends in that elementary school. Gradually came out of her shell over a couple of years. And went on to do great in high school and in college. Sort of losing the thread a little bit here. So we were com very clearly an example of a village raising the kids.
yes.
Um, Probably the most important component was Diane had a bunch of friends, including you and Janine and Dot, who were honorary aunts to them and just made a huge difference in terms of the moral support that we had as a family. And I encouraged them to talk about Diane to the kids because you and the others knew Diane before I did, and in some ways knew her better than I did, and certainly had different stories to tell about Diane to the kids. Um, the I've already talked about how supportive the school community was, of sending meals to our house so I didn't have to cook some nights, offering to babysit, taking the kids, they were involved in scouts and stuff over the next couple of years. We also had the support of our spiritual community in Cleveland, um, which was very important for me in terms of maintaining some perspective and some uh, not getting bogged down in the day-to-day trials sometimes. Um, I think I've already mentioned how generous the YMCA was in with Diane's work schedule and financially. I mean, I'm not sure why, but the executive director gave us an extra $1,000 a month during the period when she was sick to help out with costs. And with the disability retirement thing, we took the option where it lasted for whichever of us lived longer. So I've lived 40 years with financial assistance from that, her pension. Um, my Diane's parents um, were my biggest challenge, but also a huge help. They lived next door. Um, were always willing to take the kids. I was able to work part-time for the first about uh I'm having trouble with the math here. For about 8 years, I think I worked part-time so that I could be a lunch parent. I could make all the kids' school meetings, go to their um, activities, whether it was scouts or Brendan playing deck hockey or running track when he was in high school. I was able to go to all of those. So my work was extremely flexible. I mean, basically, my supervisor said, if you get the job done, you take whatever time you need. And I was able to work like one evening a week, and the Graysons would watch the kids for that evening. So, and they have still have a great relationship with their grandfather, who's still alive and is 96 now. Um, their grandmother really never recovered emotionally from losing her daughter. She lived for a couple of years. Um, I guess another advantage I had that I wanted to mention was just that having worked in mental health, um, I had some strong ideas about parenting, but I also felt they were very, very parallel with Diane's beliefs about parenting. So I felt very empowered that I was carrying out our ideas and not just my ideas of how to parent. Um, so that's, a partial list of some of the things that went right for us. And but I want to mention some other complications. So the week that Diane was diagnosed with the metastatic disease, my sister and her two children died in a house fire from a gas explosion, um, which was, you know, when I got the call from her husband, it was like, this can't be real. This is too awful to even contemplate. And um, one piece of long unfinished business for me was really grieving for them because I felt like I had to deal with my emergency with Diane and with the kids and never gave as much to the grief work I needed to do about my sister and Ryan and Lindsay. Um, and that also was complicated at the time because Newsday and the police department tried to portray this as somehow my brother-in-law's fault with no evidence.
Right.
And one thing that aggravates me is they never called me to ask, uh, is it possible that your brother-in-law something they just portrayed it in Newsday like he was a suspect in a murder instead of the victim of a tragedy.
Yeah.
Um, and that was horrible. Um, and of course, it never gets retracted. It's in the papers and then it just sort of fades away and nobody ever acknowledges that an injustice was done. Um, and as you can imagine, my brother-in-law never recovered from that, and he died of cancer about maybe 8 years after that happened. But it just shattered his life because he was absolutely devoted to the kids.
Yeah.
Um, and then a year after Diane died, my father died. He was 81. He had had a good life, and he had actually had his, retirement years, the last 20 years of his life were probably the best years of his life. He sort of blossomed after when my mother died, he really struggled, and that was a benefit for me was that he had never understood why I was interested in psychology. He was a pure science and mechanics guy. And after his wife died, and he struggled with that for the first year, he understood what I was doing and what it had to offer in a way he never had before. And that was very good for our relationship. And so when he died, he had a brain aneurysm and he was comatose for a couple of weeks. And it was my responsibility to decide when to pull the plug. And um, compared to the other stuff I went through, that wasn't too hard. The doctors assured me that there was no possibilities of future brain activity. But it just added to all the losses at that point. Um, so after Diane died, another way in which I was very fortunate was that my coworkers donated leave time. The state has a program where coworkers can donate time when somebody's had something bad happen. And they did. And so I was able to take work off from work for about, I think it was 2.5 months, um, which gave me a lot of time to do my grieving. I would go out in the park behind our house and walk for a couple hours while the kids were at school and just, go through my sadness and my memories. And um, as I remember, focusing much more on the loss and not on my usual, how am I going to cope with the next blah, blah, blah. It was less about planning and more about grieving. Um, and then when I went back to work, as I said, I worked a reduced work schedule. Um, and then another thing I did was that I had the kids and I go to bereavement groups that were run by a local hospice organization. And I think that was very helpful. The kids went through the program twice. And I think we did it the first time about a year after Diana died. Um, and they had various activities for the kids to recognize the different feelings, anger and sadness. And um, I think that was quite helpful to them. The spouses group that I was in, interestingly, was all young adults. So I probably was the oldest person in the group, and everybody else in the group was female, and like three of them had lost their partners to a relatively rare brain cancer. It was like just weird. Um, and So that was one of the other ways that we processed it. And we would go out to my spiritual community in Cleveland, and I would talk with Tom and Carolyn, and got a lot of comfort there. The So things gradually got better. Um, I started to date after about 2 years. I would always use the babysitter instead of my in-laws for those dates so that I didn't have to account to them in any way for where I was, what I was doing, how long I was gone. Um, I was able to afford an au pair, a relative of one of the families at the church, at the school. Um, so she helped us through a couple of summers. When the kids were off from school. Um, so looking back, I thought I'd list a couple of things I felt I did right. And the first one was I accepted help.
Yes.
I know we have a stereotype about men not asking for directions and not asking for help. And that does fit me in certain situations, but not in this one. And, probably partly because it was so overwhelming, partly because I certainly didn't feel that it was in any way my fault, the the situation where it was in. Um, it helped me enormously to have the kids to just focus on their well-being and their needs so that um, it couldn't mope, it couldn't get lost in my loss. Um, But as I said before, I was able to take time for myself by not working, by doing the bereavement group. Um, Another thing that I did right was that by working part-time, um, and I also stayed in a job that was less demanding at that point. Um, when I had worked with the teenagers in the hospital, it was always a job that I felt I couldn't leave at the end of the workday if there was a crisis among one of my patients. And I realized I couldn't do that when I was a single parent. So I stayed in this less demanding job for several years, so that I would be more available to the kids. Another thing I feel I did right was that I was patient. I knew from my learning in the field that it was a long process, and we're talking about years, and it goes on. Um, I think I might have mentioned to you even very recently. I digitized a bunch of old print photos we had of the early years of Diane and my relationship, and actually some photos from before I met Diane that she had taken. And looking at them, I realized how much I had focused on our loss and on trying to anticipate and do what I could about wounds that might have inflicted on the kids. But I hadn't been in touch with really my love of Diane or my excitement when I met her, um, the joy I had sometimes just looking at her, especially when she was on a horse. And so going back to those pictures just sort of reawoke those feelings. And, um, the process goes on. Um,
And you articulated it all so brilliantly. And the connections that you maintained are so key to, I think, your major success in navigating this very difficult situation. Um, that you have so many people who care about you and that you've always kept in your circle. Um, it's such a protective thing when we're going through such really horror, the difficulties of losing someone so dear to us. Roy, this has been so remarkable to hear your story, even though I know so much of the story. I'm so grateful to you for having the courage to talk about this so today. I have such gratitude for you, and this project is so dear to me for a number of reasons, because as you've experienced so many losses all in a short period of time, I did as well,
mhm.
um, including the loss of Diane, and about the same time frame. And so however this works, in the energy of life, that we were all interconnected at that period of time, it was so helpful to have one another in this whole
Yes,
series of
I
things.
can't emphasize enough my experience of that village. Um, and with very few exceptions, everybody hung in there with me. And yeah, I'm very grateful for all that support.
I don't know that anyone could articulate all of that as well as you did. So I am again very grateful to you. And I think if there's to be a part two to this, if you think of something else to say that would really help people, what you've please come back and do that. But what you've done today, I know that everyone who sees this will not forget it, and that in some way you've continued to help people by sharing this story.
Thank you. I hope it makes it easier, or maybe gives a little guidance to somebody who's struggling.
Absolutely. So thank you, Roy. I'm going to say bye for now.
Okay, bye, Patty. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
And good luck with your month-long project, as
Thank you.
well as the longer healing process that we're all going through.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roy.